All right, well, now that we got all the fittings greased, we got the motor sprayed down, we're gonna go ahead and remove the lower unit to do the water pump. First, I'd like to start off by removing the propeller. And remove the cotter pin. So the best tool for that job is a good pair of side cutters. Most of the time you can just grab the prop, remove the nut. Sometimes you have to use a block of wood to help you hold the prop in place while you loosen the nut. And remove the prop. It's a good time to check for fishing line, which we already drained and changed the lower unit oil. There was no signs of water. You want to go ahead and remove the thrust washer. That's usually where the fishing line is. And on this particular one, we do have fishing line. Which this will definitely tear up the prop shaft seals. So another good thing while you're doing a service is to remove the prop just to check for things like this. So we have the fishing line removed. Go ahead and clean the prop shaft. Since there was no water in the lower unit oil, we'll just go ahead and inspect the seals. Seals look good. I don't see any damage. So we're gonna go ahead and move on to taking the lower unit off. The bolts, there's 6 bolts around the perimeter and they're all 14 millimeters. I like to start with a 14 millimeter wrench just to crack them loose. Once you get all these cracked loose, go ahead and move on to the next one, which is removing the trim tab zinc. You want to start by removing the rubber cap. The trim tab zinc bolt is a 12 millimeter. Probably gonna need an extension. Go ahead and remove that. Helps to hold it. We'll remove that. And then up under where the trim tab zinc is, there's another 14 millimeter. We'll go ahead and remove that. On the majority of the Yamahas, there's actually 2 14 millimeters on the bottom. One is hidden by the trim tab zinc. One's open. So we'll go ahead and remove these 2 14 millimeters, and then we'll remove the remainder 6 14 millimeters around the gear case, and we'll get back. All right, so while you have the motor trimmed up, this is a good time to grease your trim. So here we have the trim pistons, and we like to put a little grease on there so that when the motor connects with them, when you're trimming it down, it creates less friction. Also, it's a big debate whether or not to grease the seals. I've personally spoken to Yamaha about this, and they say either way. But me personally, I like to go ahead and put a little grease around the seals. Just helps keep them lubricated. If there's already grease on there, you can clean the old grease off and put some fresh grease on there. Again, not to go too crazy, but just put a nice little layer of grease on there. Then once you're done greasing it, you can always go back and clean it up, make it look nice. Maybe once you get it all greased up, go ahead and trim it down. Back up again. I like to trim it down. Trim it back up again. Clean off whatever excess grease is in there. I personally feel that this helps the seals from dry rotting as fast. While we're here, we'll go ahead and check the trim indicator. A lot of times these get frozen up. So we'll go ahead and check that. It's working properly. We'll go ahead and take a little bit of our Yamaha shield. You don't want to force this. If it is stuck, you want to go ahead and spray it, let it sit for a little while, because you can break the spring. You just want to go nice and easy. Spray a little lubrication on the spring. And that right there will keep your trim indicator working properly. All right, now that we got the lower unit off, we're gonna go ahead and remove the water pump. So we have 4 12mm bolts that hold it in place. I'm gonna go ahead and remove those. Here we have the complete water pump repair kit. It comes with new hardware. The only thing it doesn't come with is the new housing. So we can discard this stuff. Sometimes you need to take a screwdriver to crack it loose. Once you crack it loose, you can pop it off. You want to inspect the housing for any melting. This one looks really good. Doesn't look like it got hot. This time the impeller came off with the cup. So go ahead and get the impeller out. This one looks like it was set in there incorrectly. And this is the first water pump that's been done on this boat, so that's actually incorrectly installed from the factory. So we're gonna do our best not to do that with the new one. So we want to remove the keyway that holds the impeller. I like to use a brass chisel. Go ahead and tap the bottom of it. And take a punch. keyway. You want to remove these 3mm bolts that hold the shift shaft. And put that off to the side. And we will remove the base. New kit comes with a new plate. I personally like to remove the dowel pins and put new ones in. So we'll grab a pair of pliers. So they get all rusty, and if you leave them in there over time, they'll rust out. And it's really hard to get them out to replace them when they get that bad. Alright, so we got those out. We'll go ahead and clean it up on the gasket surface. I use a razor blade, you can use a wire brush, but you want to make sure to get all the old gasket off so that the new one seals properly. Actually, you can use a gasket scraper. So we'll get this all cleaned up and then we'll get back when we're ready to install the new pump. Alright, so now that we've got all the surfaces cleaned up, the drive shaft had a lot of rust on it, so we went ahead and used some emery cloth, cleaned that up, put just a small amount of grease on there. We're ready to install our water pump kit. So we're going to start with making sure we have all our parts. Gaskets, our plate, our impeller, O-ring, hardware, our cup. We're going to start by putting our dowel pins back in to the proper location. I use a brass hammer, just tap them in place. Go ahead and clean up whatever water or old grease comes out. We're going to go ahead and install our gasket. It's only going to line up on the dowel pins one way, so if you don't get it right the first time, flip it over. Make sure everything's lined up, good. We'll put our plate in. You want to make sure to install the gasket and the plate before you put the keyway back in, because the plate will not slide over the keyway. I prefer installing the whole water pump repair kit instead of just putting an impeller in. That way you have all new hardware and gaskets, and that way you can ensure proper water flow. I like to put a little bit of grease on the keyway. Just helps it slide into place better. Take my brass punch. Punch it into place. have it in all the way, the impeller will not slide over it. And we'll go ahead and put our impeller on. The impeller only goes on one way. There's a slot for the keyway on one side, and the other there's not. So you want to line that up with your keyway. And again, cleaning the drive shaft helps the impeller go on a lot easier. So now we need to take our water pump housing. We need to pull the old O-ring out. Discard that, we're not going to use that. Need a little pick. On the 4.2 liters, there's actual seals that seal in the drive shaft. And the water pump kit comes with new ones. So you're gonna wanna change those out. And it's just held in by 2 tabs on either side. Sometimes it pops out and goes crazy. So you wanna remove the old seals. Normally they just pop right out. Put it on the bench. There's one. And these do go in a certain way, so make sure that, and they both go the same way, so make sure that you can tell which way the seals go when you install the new ones. If you want to come over here, you can see the difference. The seal is open on this side and closed on this side, so you want to put the closed side down when you install the new ones. So we're going to go ahead and get the water pump the housing all cleaned up and ready to install the new seals and the new water pump. Alright, so now that we have the water pump housing cleaned up, we replaced the drive shaft seals in the housing. We pulled the water tube seal out, cleaned it up, put a little grease on it. You want to make sure underneath the cup there's a small O-ring that goes in there that comes in the kit. What I like to do is put a little grease in the groove where the seal sits. That way when you install the new O-ring, it sits in there and doesn't fall out of place. Once you get that in, you want to go ahead and put the new cup in. And there's actually a little notch and groove that it sits in, so you want to make sure that that cup is sitting flush. Once you get the cup in, I like to fill the groove for the seal for the housing. Fill that with grease. That just helps the O-ring stay in place when you install the housing on the impeller. Go ahead and put some grease on there. Alright, and then we'll go ahead and install the O-ring. Once you install the O-ring, some of that grease is going to squirt out, so you can clean up the extra grease after you get the O-ring in. You just go around, slide the O-ring in place. Once it's in place, go ahead and clean up the extra grease. I like to just put a small layer around the housing. Alright, so now that's done, we're going to set that to the side. There's several things you can do to help the impeller for the initial startup. What I like to do is just put a little grease on each of the vanes. Don't go crazy. can also put soap inside the cup. You just want to help for the initial startup. Just helps prevent premature wear on the impeller. The grease is just my preferred method. Again, if you go crazy and slap a bunch of grease in there, once you start it up, you're going to be running the grease through your cooling system, so you want to be careful not to get too crazy with it. Just a nice thin layer. Also a thin layer of grease on your shift shaft. If you put a ton of grease on there, it's actually can cause issues with the shifting, so you just want a nice thin layer. Also put a little grease around the speedometer pickup, so that when you put the lower unit on, it just slides right on there. And we're ready to install the housing. So what I like to do is go ahead and set it on the impeller and make sure you face it in the right direction. Put it on top of the impeller. Take a rag, grab the drive shaft, and apply light pressure on top of the housing and spin the shaft at the same time. And it just pops right on. Now I like to just look down in the pickup tube, make sure that the O-ring didn't come off. You can normally see it down in there if it did. Just spin the impeller, make sure it's free. Then you're ready to put your bolts in. That's how you change a water pump. All right, now that we have our water pump installed, where it's time to put the lower unit back on the motor. So I started by putting a little grease on these two dowel pins that hold the gear case in place. Normally when the gear case gets stuck to the midsection, that's usually the culprit. So just put a little grease on there, makes it easier for the next time. So let's go ahead and put our gear case back up. You want to make sure that the shift shaft goes in the proper location. Just like that. I went ahead and put grease on all my bolts. Again, just for next time when you have to change your water pump, the bolts come out a lot easier. So we'll go ahead and put our bolts back in. We'll put our trim tab zinc back on. We'll put our propeller back on, and that would conclude the 100-hour service.